My name is Hal Grodovan, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of you here today for our 7th annual conference on New Worlds of Adoption. I welcome all of you who are here for the first time and all of those who are here for returning times. I know many of you have been to many of these conferences, and it's great to see you all back. Just by way of introduction about our program, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we do. The Rudd Adoption Research Program here at UMass Amherst conducts state-of-the-art research on topics regarding the psychology of adoption that will impact policy at state, agency, federal, and international levels. We train postdoctoral scholars, graduate students, and undergraduate students in the theories and methods necessary to study adoption and adoptive families. We provide conferences, seminars, workshops, and publications that are relevant for people who work in the field and people who work directly with families and for people whose lives are touched by adoption themselves. And we also participate in key community partnerships that connect our research with those who need it and with those we can connect in terms of policy and practice. Today is our 7th conference, and today's theme builds on the themes that we've seen in the last several years. We've learned from Mary Dozier a couple of years ago about the importance of early attachment. We learned from Megan Gunner about the issues involved in adolescence and adoption. And last year we learned from Phil Fisher about neurobiological underpinnings of adoption and risk, and early risk and adversity, and some of the issues involved with that. Today we turn the spotlight on strengths and resilience in the transition to adulthood. What do we know about the features of everyday life that promote competence and resilience in young people who've experienced adoption or foster care as they move toward adulthood? These are important questions that we will all talk about together today. It's my privilege at the beginning to acknowledge Andrew and Virginia Rudd, whose vision and generosity and commitment to adoption have made our work possible. In fact, without their gift to UMass Amherst, none of us would be in this room here today. We've had many accomplishments in the past year, but one that I'm the proudest of is that we've had our first 3 doctoral students graduate in clinical psychology who've worked with me and worked in the Rudd program, and both Holly Grant Marsney and Quade French are here today. So the Rudd's generosity has launched a whole new generation of adoption researchers and professionals, and we're very fortunate to have Andrew and Virginia here today. So if I could ask them to stand and for us to acknowledge them, and I'd also like to ask Holly and Quade, if you would stand. Let's see, there's Quade, where's Holly? Congratulations to them. So thank you for that. So now it's my privilege to introduce our provost, Catherine Newman, who's going to welcome you to the conference on behalf of the university. Dr. Newman assumed the office of provost and senior vice chancellor for academic affairs this past fall. As the chief academic officer for UMass, she provides leadership for the mission of the university in education, research, service, and connection of UMass to the community and to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She completed her undergraduate degree at the University of California, San Diego, and her PhD at Berkeley. Her scholarship is on work that would be of interest to many of you here in this room regarding inequality and poverty and policies that affect families and how we can do a better job of thinking about policy that affects families in these areas. She has held academic posts at Columbia, Harvard, Radcliffe, Princeton, and Johns Hopkins universities. And throughout her career, she's combined both academic work and academic leadership work. She's published 12 books and 5 edited volumes on important topics such as poverty and policy, and she really believes in the marriage of academic leadership and scholarship, so that both things are possible and both things are interconnected. Here at UMass, she has also been known for her rigorous standards, for her boundless energy, and for asking questions like, why not? And to me, as an academic administrator myself, I've been really pleased by that because it's allowed us to think in some new ways about the procedures and policies here at the university. So I'm really delighted that she's been able to join us this morning. Please join me in welcoming Provost Catherine Newman.
Well, thank you, Hal, for that lovely introduction. It's really a delight for me to be here to welcome all of you to the University of Massachusetts Amherst and to the Department of Psychological and Brain Science, which is the host for this fantastic conference, the 7th New World of Adoption Conference, made possible, as Hal explained, through the activities of the Rudd Family Foundation Chair in Psychology, which he holds, and we are very proud of that indeed. As he mentioned, the Rudd Chair was established. That's not a bad slip, actually. Established in 2005 through a generous gift made to the university by Andrew and Virginia Rudd, who are themselves adoptive parents whose daughter was an undergraduate in our psychology department, and I have to imagine she had a great experience here at UMass, or they would not have become so generous as donors to our great university. In gratitude for that excellent experience, they donated funds to create Hal's endowed chair that would allow us to have a permanent position devoted to the psychological study of adoption, and committed, as any land-grant university should be, to connecting that knowledge with practitioners who work with people whose lives are touched by adoption and policymakers who have a powerful say in making important decisions about how adoption occurs in the United States and around the world. And I know many of you in the audience are exactly those practitioners and policymakers. So it's a special pleasure to welcome you here to experience the fruits of this generous donation, what it has made possible in terms of research and policy suggestions. Here are just a few examples of the way in which this investment has made a difference. As Hal mentioned, through the Rudd program, mentoring is being provided for graduate and undergraduate students who are interested in the research topic of adoption. And the first 3 graduate students in clinical psychology in that field received their PhDs just last spring. So that is the beginning of a long train of new scholars who will forward this field and help us learn more about the process of adoption and to inform policymakers in ways that create evidence-based policy. Second, the Rudd program is partnering with the Treehouse Foundation, the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, and many other community organizations in the Re-Envisioning Foster Care in America initiative, a very important aspect of adoption, especially for children from low-income backgrounds. Third, the Adoption Mentoring Program. It's now in its 5th successful year of matching our UMass undergraduate students who themselves were adopted with adopted children in our Amherst community. And you will hear, I understand, a panel of present and former members and mentors discussing their experiences this afternoon. As you know, you are here to attend the 7th annual conference, New Worlds of Adoption. Each of them has taken on a distinctive focus on contemporary issues, as Hal mentioned, with today's conference focusing on resilience, strengths, and the question of how people launch into adulthood. This is a particularly challenging time to launch into adulthood, and I thought I might say a few words about my own research interest in that area. In 2012, I published a book called The Accordion Family, which looks at the extended period of time that young people in this generation are spending in their natal homes. This is at an all-time high, especially compared to the long-distant past when young people in my generation, for example, didn't want to be caught at home after the age of 18. It has now become a national experience for young people to return to their family homes, even if they have attended colleges like ours. So the rate at which young people, and not so young anymore, are living with their parents over the age of 22 is the highest it has been since the Great Depression. That is because economic pressures, especially powerful in affecting the life chances of young people, are providing them with fewer options than they once had. Their employment opportunities have been heavily affected all along in the last 30 years, but especially in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008. There has been an increasing emphasis on credentials, Higher education plays a very big role there. It's expensive. It is expensive to continue education well beyond the bachelor's degree, but the necessity to do so for children who hope to launch themselves into professional careers is another factor that is pushing them back into the family home. But the rate at which this happens varies from one country to another. This is extremely pronounced in countries like Japan, Italy, Spain, where the weak welfare state means that there's very few options for the support of higher education and very few options in the housing market, which leaves young people pushed back into the family home in record numbers. And this has implications for everything. It has implications for the rate of family formation. In the US, it's having implications for the housing market. Whether or not the housing market revives at all is connected to the increasing economic pressures on this generation entering into the labor market. But the variation is enormous. If you look at Sweden, for example, or any of the other social democratic countries, you almost can't find the phenomenon of the accordion family. And that's because Sweden's social welfare policies promote independence, invest heavily in free higher education, make it very easy for young people to be geographically mobile, and provide tremendous supports for the family from cradle to grave. So understanding family formation patterns is very much a question of understanding how the welfare state and the policy apparatus of our country and other countries affects the most basic aspects of family formation. How do these aspects of policy affect adoption? To my knowledge, nobody has looked at this issue. No one has looked at how the pressure that I know of, and maybe there are people out there in the audience who would enlighten me, how the pressures that young people in this generation are facing as a consequence of tightening economic difficulties have affected children who have been adopted. I don't know whether the patterns are the same or different as children who weren't, but it seems to me worth paying attention to. One of the things I learned in writing The Accordion Family, again, was how powerful social policy is in determining the life chances of this generation. But social policy also expresses deep values, and here there is a role for ethicists, philosophers, and others, just citizens, to ask themselves whether the policies in play accurately reflect the values that we hold. So, for example, we might ask, why is it that reimbursement rates for kin-based foster care and non-kin-based foster care are so different? It doesn't cost more to raise a child who's unrelated to you than a child who's related to you, but the reimbursement rates for kin-based foster care are about 1/3 what they are for non-kin-based foster care. That tells us something about what our society values, how we think obligations should be distributed, and has a very powerful effect on whether or not families, especially those at the low income end, can survive at all when they take up the responsibilities we expect them to take up to care for their extended family members. I raise this just as an example of the ways in which policy and values need to be understood in the same cauldron. They don't always align, and it is the role of scientific investigation to bring those discordant episodes to our attention and cause policymakers to reflect more deeply. You are going to hear a lot more about this as you launch into the conversation about adulthood, and I commend it to you. I look forward to hearing about the results of your conference. I'm thrilled to death this is taking place here at UMass, which stands as a land-grant university for the very principle of engagement of science with policy, science with the community, science with the world, in order to make it a better world. So welcome to the epicenter of the land-grant university here at UMass, and thank you, Hal, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Provost Newman. You've really raised some wonderful questions, some really important questions for us to be thinking about, and so I'm glad that those are in the mix as we go through our program today. And I like thinking about this as the epicenter of what's going on here, so it's great. It's now my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Ann Masten. Ann Masten is a Regents Professor and the Irving B. Harris Professor of Child Development at the University of Minnesota. The Pioneer Valley is familiar to Ann as she completed her undergraduate degree in psychology here at Smith College. A licensed psychologist, she completed her doctoral training in the psychology department at the University of Minnesota and did a clinical internship at UCLA. She then joined the faculty at the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota, which is my alma mater, and also chaired the department for 6 years. Her research is directed at understanding the processes that promote competence and resilience in human development, with a focus on protective processes in the context of high cumulative risk, adversity, and trauma. She directs the Project Competence studies of risk and resilience, including studies of normative populations and high-risk young people exposed to war, natural disasters, poverty, homelessness, and migration. She's the past president of the Society for Research in Child Development, and she's the recipient of the 2014 Uri Bronfenbrenner Award for Lifetime Contributions to the Developmental Psychology in the Service of Science and Society. She's published numerous articles and books on risk and resilience, including a recent book called Ordinary Magic: Resilience in Development, which is actually available on the book table in the back, and she would also be happy to sign copies if you would like. She's given many presentations around the world, but I noticed that she also recently developed a MOOC, a massive open online course offered through Coursera for free on the topic of resilience in children exposed to trauma, disaster, and war, global perspectives. So we're so honored that Anne is here with us today and would like to please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Well, thank you, Hal, for that lovely introduction. I'll turn off the other mic. Can you all hear me back there in the back? Okay. I'm going to pull up my talk, and then we'll get started. I'm going to talk to you today about resilience and invite you to think about the issues that concern you in your work, professional, or personal life around adoption through the lens of a resilience perspective. I'm not the expert on adoption here, you all are, but I have a lot of experience with adoption indirectly because it plays such a large role in the research on resilience. I'm going to present a little bit of history and then talk about the meaning of resilience and the ways that research has been conducted, highlight some of the major findings, and then talk a little bit about emerging adulthood as a window of opportunity for promoting resilience in young people. Resilience is all around us, and I'm sure all of you have observed it in your work and personal life, and it is probably not difficult to think of someone who you know from personal experience has overcome adversity and gone on to have a very successful and productive life. I see this every day in the work I do with survivors of war and also with children and parents who live in emergency shelters. A lot of my recent work has been focused on homeless and highly mobile families. Some of the people, I'm getting an echo, is anybody else? This is off. Let me try lowering this. Is that a little better? Okay. Some of the people, no, this is worse. I don't know. Okay. I'll switch mics if this doesn't stop. Some of the people who show resilience are very famous, like Malala, but most of the people who experience resilience and whose lives we want to understand are not famous, well-known people like our youngest Nobel Prize winner. Here's a resilient young person who you may have heard of because his life has been featured in documentaries, but Mike grew up in a very difficult family situation, and there was a lot of violence in the family, and his mother had struggled with alcohol problems, And he was a complete delinquent by the time he was a teenager, grew up in Minneapolis. But he went on to become a surgeon at the University of Minnesota. He turned his life around in this period we're talking about today, emerging adulthood, and I can tell you more about him if you're interested later. How did he do it? What made a difference? What made that possible for this young person? Resilience occurs naturally, and we can study naturally occurring resilience, but it also occurs by design. And we can try to understand through research how to promote resilience. And the interventions to promote resilience take many different forms, and those include foster care or a crisis nursery. They include humanitarian aid, and of course they include adoption. Adoption was for a long time conceptualized as a way to promote positive development in children who lost their families or parents for whatever reason. The study of resilience goes back about half a century, the scientific study, but I think that humans have been interested in resilience for way longer than that, and I think that because a lot of our stories in legends and myths and folk tales, oral traditions handed down over the centuries, focus on stories of people who overcome difficulty to succeed in life, and there are many teaching stories of that kind. So what led to the scientific study of resilience? I think it's important to go back to World War II, so I just wanted to mention this for you here today. World War II was a devastating experience internationally, and it raised tremendous attention to the impact of war on children and child development. Millions of children worldwide were affected by World War II. There were millions of parents were killed in World War II and left their children orphaned. Many other children were displaced. Many children were engaged in the war and injured in the war. And around the world, this raised a lot of attention to the impact of trauma and loss on children. And people began to systematically study children and in trauma, facing trauma, and the impact of all kinds of loss of parents, injuries, and so forth on child development. And this is the point at which UNICEF was founded. In the aftermath of World War II, there was such widespread devastation affecting children that the United Nations founded their Emergency Fund for Children and began to intervene. They saved many, many children in Europe and elsewhere who would have starved to death or not found families without the aid of UNICEF and similar humanitarian agencies. This is a photograph from some archives at the University of Minnesota of one orphan taking care of another orphan in one of the many places where the children of World War II, people were trying to help them. These three individuals were all, I think, profoundly affected by World War II as young people, and they went on to become pioneers in resilient science, and I don't think that's a coincidence. The first one is Norman Garmezy. He was my mentor at the University of Minnesota, one of the leading pioneers in the study of resilience. He was a soldier in World War II as a young man, and he fought at the Battle of the Bulge, for example, and I think he was profoundly affected by that experience. He came back to the United States, went on to become a clinical psychology professor and researcher, and eventually turned his research to trying to understand how resilience happens and how could you promote it in children and adults when it's not naturally occurring. Emmy Werner was one of the children of Europe who experienced the bombing and survived and would not maybe have survived the aftermath of the war without the assistance of care packages and UNICEF. She has vivid memories of those experiences as a young girl, and she's written a very moving book about children in World War II. She went on to start probably the most famous study of resilience in developmental science, the study of the children of Kauai, which has now gone on for about 5 decades. And then Sir Michael Rudder, he was a young boy in World War II, and he was one of the children evacuated during the Blitz to prevent the children from being killed during the bombing of England. And he was one of what's called the sea evacuees. He was evacuated over the ocean to the United States. Again, I think that had a profound effect on him, and he became not only the leading child psychiatrist in the world, but also one of the leading proponents of resilience for decades. So these investigators initially studied risk in children. I think the whole movement that came out of World War II was recognizing the huge impact of these experiences on child development. And many people, like clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, were interested in the impact of risk and adverse experiences on the development of mental health problems and psychopathology. And these investigators were among those researchers who studied risk. But what was different about their work is they came to realize that many of the young people they were studying, trying to understand the processes that lead to mental health problems, were actually showing positive development. And they realized that the importance of understanding not just risk for problems, but also understanding how is it that so many of the young people we're following who have experienced all kinds of trauma and risk actually are doing so well. And they recognize the significance of that phenomenon for what we need to learn in order to promote resilience when it isn't naturally occurring. Since that time, since the time of the pioneers, which was early 70s, there have been 4 waves of resilience science, overlapping waves. The first wave, typical of early development in any science, was descriptive, trying to understand, well, who is resilient and what makes a difference? What are the protective factors that seem to be associated with better outcomes under high-risk circumstances? How do we do research on resilience anyway? How do we measure it? That sort of thing. When people began to get a handle on the basics, they began to want to understand, well, how does this work? If this is a protective factor, having a good parent is a protective factor, or having good executive function skills is protective, well, how does that work in your life? Because if you're going to intervene, you need to understand more deeply how processes are working, so you can figure out how to promote those processes in the life of a child or family. Well, once people did research where they thought they'd figured out processes and how resilience works and which protective factors are important, then they began to try to intervene and do research targeting resilience, trying to promote better executive function or provide better parenting, promote better parenting. And some of the speakers that have come to this conference over the years are wonderful examples of researchers like Mary Dozier and Phil Fisher. They've both done resilience-based research trying to target a protective system, parenting, in both of their cases. Foster parenting in the case of Phil Fisher and home parenting in the case of Mary Dozier. They've developed interventions and done experiments to show that their interventions promote better parenting and you get better results in the children when you promote that protective factor. The most recent wave of resilience research is what I call integrative. This is the 4th wave, and I'll come back to that at the end of my discussion. This is a wave which is bringing together resilience science across many levels of analysis, from a genetic level to a societal level. Well, what does resilience mean? The meaning of resilience has changed over the years, even within developmental science, and it's become more and more dynamic. And I wanted to share with you my favorite, current favorite definition of resilience, which is here. And this definition is deliberately broad because in the 4th wave of resilience science, it's becoming critically important that people who study different fields can talk to each other, and that we can integrate what we're learning about molecular genetics of resilience with what we know about the psychology of resilience and social processes in resilience and community resilience and so forth. So there's an interest worldwide among resilience scientists from many different fields to develop a working methods and vocabulary that is scalable across levels of analysis. So the capacity of a dynamic system to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten that system, its function, its life, its viability, its development. This could be any system. The concept of resilience can be applied to any dynamic system. So I'm going to focus on the resilience of individual children, but I will mention a little bit about the resilience of families, communities, and so forth. You could talk about the resilience of a business and an organization. Everybody on the planet's a little bit worried about the resilience of the planet in terms of global climate change. You can use this concept in any kind of system. And when you do, you have to define, what do you mean by positive adaptation? What are the kind of challenges that a system is facing? I'm going to focus on individuals, but you can do this kind of research with any kind of dynamic system. People are living, developing systems, and that's important to keep in mind. The development of an individual child is influenced by the interaction of many systems across levels. The biology of a child is influencing development, as well as the environment, their family system, their community. The health system in a town will influence the development of a child because it will influence the kind of care that they get. And one way to think about this is to keep in mind that the systems in a child or a young person's life are embedded, interacting, and interdependent. Those of you who know Bronfenbrenner will recognize this is not the usual way of portraying Bronfenbrenner's ecosystem models, but I like this way of illustrating systems. And what you see, the child is in blue. Well, I can't see the blue here, but here's the child. Within the child are many systems, their immune system, their cardiovascular system, and so forth. But this child is embedded in the life of a family. There's a family system that will influence this child. This child is also part of a peer group. They're part of a classroom. Those are the microsystems that Bronfenbrenner talks about. But each of those systems the child is embedded in is in turn embedded in other systems, communities, nations, cultures, and so forth. I couldn't even illustrate them all here. I just want you to think about embedded systems. And all of these systems will influence the development of a child and also how that child will respond to a threat or a challenge. Resilience is dynamic in part because all of these systems are dynamic, and the capacity for adapting to adversity, whether you're talking about a child or a family, is distributed across systems. The capacity to adapt is not embedded solely in an individual person. It's distributed across systems. So the resilience of an individual child is going to depend on the resilience of other systems they're interacting with, the resources around them, their family, how well their family is functioning, how well the child welfare system is functioning, and so forth. And that's very important to keep in mind when you're thinking about how to promote and protect the lives of children. When you define resilience in a child, or a family for that matter, or any other system, as I mentioned, you have to think about these two fundamental criteria. What are the challenges threatening the system? And many different kinds of challenges have been studied in resilience in children, ranging from war and natural disaster to child abuse in the home to foster care. There are many kinds of disturbances that can influence and challenge the life of a child. Some of them are acute, and some of them are very chronic. But we also have to think about, what do we mean by adaptation? The simplest way to think about that, I think, is to ask this question: how well is the system doing? You know, in the case of a child, as a developmental scientist, I'm very interested in how well a child is developing in terms of what we know about, the expected motor development, psychological development. How well is this child meeting the developmental task expectations at a given age. And, so I'm looking in a very young child, are they learning the language, are they learning to walk? And as children get older in the United States, most families and society is looking how well are they doing in school, how well are they getting along with other children and the teacher, are they breaking the law, that sort of thing. These are all the expectations we have for deciding whether development is going well. Now, you could also look at the negative indicators. I'm one of those people who likes to look at the positive, competent side of the story. But you can also study resilience in terms of which children are developing trauma symptoms and which children are not, even though they're facing a similar situation. You can study resilience in terms of people who continue to function well, even in a situation that may trigger post-traumatic stress disorder in other children. Developmental tasks are a very important part of the science on resilience in children that has developed over the past few decades. These people have tried to measure and understand, the competence and positive aspects of development. And I mentioned some of these here from early childhood and school age. And I also wanted to focus on emerging adulthood, since that's what we're focusing on here. In emerging adulthood, some of the developmental tasks of childhood continue. It's still important for many young people, they're continuing to go to school. You're still expected to follow the rules of society and not run around breaking the law, like that doctor did when he was a teenager. He entertained himself with his friends by stealing cars and doing drugs and things like that, which is not approved of in Minneapolis or many other places. And it's also important to continue to get along with peers and teachers and coworkers and so forth. But there are some new tasks that emerge in this window of development. Many young people begin to work and explore the world of work, and you have to be able to function in the world of work and get along with other people and carry out your tasks. People begin to have romantic relationships, and some folks do better than others in the context of these relationships. And then people begin to have children of their own, and as soon as you begin to have children of your own, society expects you to take care of those children and do right by them in some way or another. In developmental task theory, there's a couple of important ideas, and I'll be brief here. One critical idea is the notion that competence begets competence, that as you establish, a solid footing in early childhood, it carries forward. If you have success in developmental tasks at one period of development, it sets the stage for positive development in the future. And similarly, if you have a young child, let's say a preschooler who's having trouble regulating their own behavior, that child can go to school and things may not go well. They bring their problems to school, they begin to have trouble learning, they don't get along with the teacher, they're rejected by the other kids because they can't control their behavior. Then you get kind of a negative cascade, a snowball effect. And in resilience research and intervention, there's a lot of interest in the idea of developmental cascades because ideally you'd like to prevent the negative ones or interrupt them and promote positive cascades. A lot of the times we want to intervene to promote resilience. We want to get the timing right so that we get a positive cascade from one area of development to another over time. Another thing that's been very important in the study of resilience is the idea of pathways. Pathways just refers to, if you're tracking adaptive function over time, how well is it going? There are ups and downs, and people often draw pathways like this. These are different pathways that have been observed and studied in the field of resilience and psychopathology in the aftermath of an acute threat to development or function. And what you see here are different responses to an acute trauma of some kind. Pattern A there is often called the stress resistance pattern. There are people, children included, who even though they experience trauma, they may wobble a little bit, but they keep up a steady course of pretty good functioning, often because they have many protective factors. We'll come back to that. Pattern B is quite different. This is a breakdown and recovery pattern. And this is actually, if you have severe, sudden adversity, this is quite normative. To break down, your functioning drops off, and then you recover over time. You see this after earthquakes, you see it after a violent experience that a young person may have, and I'm going to present a case in a moment that illustrates this pattern. Pattern C is really of great interest recently. This is post-traumatic growth represented here. Some people respond to challenge by mobilizing and growing in various ways. It has not been studied that much in children, but it has been observed anecdotally. And then you have, of course, breakdown without recovery as yet. Patterns E and D here represent either immediate breakdown or a delayed breakdown. And these two pathways don't show recovery yet. That doesn't mean that won't happen in the future, but at the time point we left off here, it hadn't happened yet. You also can look at pathways from a more chronic picture. A lot of the times the adversities that children experience are not out of the blue, sudden, and acute. They are chronic and persisting. And I think this is a very important kind of pathway to consider in the area of adoption, because the context of adoption, whether you're talking about war survivors, children orphaned by Ebola, children who have experienced a lot of abuse or been abandoned, there's often a chronic picture of adversity that precedes that. And what you see in this picture is that in conditions of severe adversity at the beginning of the graph, you see a decline in functioning. We don't expect resilience. You don't expect children to hold on when they're experiencing chronic, threatening, abusive, intolerable kind of situations. Where you see the resilience is when there's either a naturally occurring or an intervention and conditions improve. And when you normalize conditions, then you begin to see the resilience emerge. If you think about the studies of institutionalized children from, like, for example, from the Romanian orphanages of the Ceausescu regime, those children declined in functioning basically over time. But when they were adopted internationally into healthy households, many of those children showed a dramatic recovery when they were put in a good recovery environment. But not all of them showed 100% recovery. Sometimes children can't fully recover because, for example, there's been damage. If you've been bashed against the wall, you may not recover from that because there's a lasting injury. But there is often dramatic recovery if you improve conditions. And you can see this in many, many case examples. You can also see it in a lot of the research on children who've been moved from a terrible situation into a much better situation, often by improving the quality of the family and caregiving environment. I want to talk very briefly about an example of a child I'll call Sarah. It's a published case. You can read about her. I met this child when she was 2.5 years old. I was part of a treatment team. She was hospitalized at the age of 30 months with complete growth failure. She fell below the second percentile on all growth parameters, height, weight, and head circumference. She had very strange behaviors. And we were presented with this question. Let me show you the question, and I'll come back to her growth chart. As the team, the question for us was, should this little girl be institutionalized or adopted? Well, that's a profound presenting question. And we were kind of stunned by that as the team, but that was a very serious question. The social welfare agency, this child was a foster child. They were obviously very concerned about her, and they wanted to know if there was something wrong with her that she would require special care, or if they should begin looking for an adopting home. So she was hospitalized where that red arrow is, and as soon as we began to look into her history, we got a very interesting take on her story. This child had been abandoned at the age of about 1 day old. Her parent was somebody living on the streets, father unknown, and she was placed into a foster home and did very well in this first foster home, and was growing normally, developing normally. And then when she was about 1 year old, her foster father became ill suddenly and died from some heart problem or something. And this mother was devastated. The foster mother was devastated. There were several other children. When this little girl was 15 months old, the foster mother called up the social work agency and said, I can't handle this anymore. She was too depressed, and I need you to come pick up the children and move them somewhere else. So this child at 15 months old was suddenly, she'd already lost her father, she was very attached to. She was suddenly picked up by a total stranger and taken to another stranger's house and left there, second foster home. And her reaction was to go into a complete developmental tailspin. Apparently there were very good records on her because she was a foster care child. She sat in the window for a month waiting for somebody to come back and get her. She stopped walking, talking, and so forth. Her developmental parameters started to decline, and after a while, there was tremendous concern, and they hospitalized her about a year later to see what was going on with her. Well, our team did a very careful workup. She had every kind of medical workup. There was nothing observably wrong with this child's biology. And this team concluded that she needed a new environment. And we had a rare opportunity to write a prescription for a new environment because the social welfare agency was wanting to find the best possible adopting home for her. We recommended that she be adopted straight out of the hospital. We were convinced that what she needed was a good match for her needs. And I'll leave you to think about what kind of prescription you would write for a family for little Sarah. What would be important for her? What would suit her needs? They found what we thought was a perfect family. She was adopted right out of the hospital, made a spectacular recovery across the board. It took a while. I mean, to get back on her normal growth curve took about 6 to 12 months, depending on the area. But she flourished in this home and continues to flourish. She's now a young woman, grown-up young woman, and this worked out well. Another example I want to share with you is from the Project Competence research study. This is not a case analysis, but rather a research investigation on risk and resilience. And what I want to do is give you an example of another window of development. With Sarah, we intervened in what I think of as one of the important windows for windows of opportunity for promoting resilience, early childhood. But emerging adulthood is another window of opportunity, and I just want to share a little bit of data. The Project Competence longitudinal study is a study of ordinary kids. It's not a high-risk study, although if you follow 200 people over time, you gather all kinds of data about the kinds of adversities and risks that they experience. So there were many traumatized people in this cohort. But when we followed them from childhood into adulthood, but when this sample was about 20 years old, we classified them into categories based on their life history of adversity and how well they were doing at the age of 20 on the major developmental task criteria at 20. How they were getting along with people, how they were doing at work or at school, and whether they were having what I would call appropriate conduct, unlike Dr. Mattis. And we classified them into these groups, and we were particularly interested in looking at people who had very high adversity history, but were showing good outcomes. How are they like and unlike the kids who had similarly high adversity but didn't turn out well? And then we also were curious to see how the people we called resilient looked, what were their characteristics compared to other people who were competent but had never experienced this great adversity. We also would have been willing to look at this group, people who had low adversity but were not doing well, only they were too rare to study. This is a rare category. Competence and development in a normative sample is very biased toward good adaptation. So when they were 20 years old, this is how the three groups that we could compare, the competent group, the resilient group, and the maladaptive group, looked on a very important protective factor, cognitive skills. And you can see the clear difference here. There were big effect size differences between these groups. But the other thing that's striking is how much alike the competent and the resilient groups look. The people that had experienced high adversity, if they had protective factors like this, looked very much like the young people who had never experienced great adversity. Here's another example of a very important variable we measured at age 20. How motivated were they for the future? How much were they planning for their future life? And you can see even a greater difference here. There was a huge difference between the young people who weren't doing well at the age of 20, who had experienced adversity, that's this group, and the young people who were doing well at 20, who'd also experienced very similar levels of adversity on being planful and motivated for the future. But I want to show you one more thing. We followed these young people another 10 years into the future, and then we could look backwards. If you go 10 years down the road and split this group, I'm going to split this group here into two groups, the people who will remain maladaptive and the people that will turn their lives around. And what you see on this variable is the group that will turn their lives around right here, they become resilient. They develop into successful adults. They're already looking more like these other groups. And if you take a look at them on another variable, which we were interested in, autonomy, they were very similar to the competent and resilient groups, even though their own resilience here had not emerged yet at the age of 20. They were already showing some of the key protective factors that would make it possible for them to change. They also had a lot of other things going for them, we discovered. They were not only more planful and motivated to achieve, they also had more connection to adult mentors and supports. They were moving themselves into opportunity windows. They were joining the military. They were moving to better jobs. Some of them were falling in love with positive, healthy people. This is a good move if you're, off track as a young person. One of our most dramatically turnaround cases fell in love with a police officer's daughter when he was 17. He was a big surprise 10 years down the road. He looked a lot better because that father whipped him into shape over those years. This is also the window, though, of religious conversion, and some young people showed a change in faith. And this has led me to kind of describe this window. What is it going on in emerging adulthood that makes it possible for there to be a turn in the right direction? Because you see, there's many studies of resilience, as well as many case reports of resilience that show this as a window of opportunity where people who have gotten off track earlier in development stage a recovery or show resilience. What happens? Well, I just mentioned a few things here for you to think about. One is opportunities. There are new opportunities that most societies offer young people in this window, and that's critically important. You also have brain development on your side. As many of you would be well aware, there is a surge in brain development in the emerging adulthood window that boosts up, makes your final capabilities come online for planning ahead, thinking about the future, considering the fact that, gosh, I'm going to end up incarcerated if I keep going down this pathway. And we saw with Dr. Mattis, the surgeon, there was a cognitive awareness that came into play when he was in his late teens, encouraged by his parole officer. You need to start thinking about where you're going. And he decided to join the military, among other things. But there's also an interesting surge in motivation to get out there and do something and change your life. And we have to support and scaffold this kind of coming together. You have a convergence of different things going on in emerging adulthood that opens a very important window of opportunity for moving in the direction of resilience. So what have we learned over time about resilience from many different kinds of studies? There's been all kinds of different work all over the world and many different ways of thinking about resilience, but there are some striking consistencies in what we've learned. And I've called the most widely implicated protective factors the short list. And these are the protective factors that come up over and over again in many different studies, many different situations. They come up in war, they come up in studies of child maltreatment. These are associated with resilience under very adverse circumstances. And you notice I've given examples here of different levels. It's a different level to have capable caregiving, effective schools, and good self-regulation skills. So what does this short list mean? I have argued that it means that in many different situations, there are some profound and profoundly important fundamental protective systems that protect human development and promote good outcomes under challenging situations. And these have evolved through cultural and biological evolution over the millennia of human life. And they've been shaped by cultural learning as well as biological natural selection. And these are the adaptive systems that promote human function and development. A good caregiving and family attachment system is profoundly important, as you all know, for not only promoting healthy development in general, but for promoting resilience in high-risk situations. Can we promote resilience? I would argue yes, and I think we have a growing body of work saying, indicating that we can promote resilience. And I've described in various writings a framework to think about promoting resilience. And the whole research of resilience, the impact in the intervention field has been transformative. In the olden days, a lot of times intervention was thought about from a medical model or addressing risk and so forth, or let's fix this child, let's give them some medicine or whatever. And I think what happened with the resilience framework is that people began to look at a positive framework for intervention. How can we define our mission in positive ways, frame positive goals, promote positive development? Can we include positive influences? There's more to life than risk, people realized. We need to measure positive influences and outcomes. You're not going to see the positive outcomes if you don't even measure them, people realized. And there are some strategies that the resilience literature points to, I'll come back to in a moment. And then we have a framework that if you take systems seriously, you have to think about multiple levels of function and where do we have the most leverage to intervene. These are the three strategies for positive change. You can focus on risk. You can try to reduce risk factors. You can try to reduce the exposure of children to adversity or reduce, like homelessness isn't good for children. It'd be good if we could prevent that. We've been very successful in the U.S. preventing premature birth, although we could do a much better job. We're not as high as we should be for the level of wealth in this country. It's way easier to prevent premature birth than to deal with a premature baby. We also can focus on assets, making resources available, whether it's a tutor or a school or all kinds of resources, healthier food. We can provide books. There's lots of resources you can provide to boost better functioning in children. But if you really want to mobilize the most powerful engines for change, you want to mobilize those big protective systems, the ones I call ordinary magic. You want to either restore or harness the most powerful adaptive systems for human development. And you can think of adoption as an effort to intervene in the most powerful system for human development, which is family, attachment, caregiving, and so forth. I will just briefly say again that I think there are very important windows of opportunity to consider in development. It's not just what we do, it's when we do it. And in the case of Sarah, we intervened at a very opportune moment for her to have a new family and begin to flourish. But there are other windows of opportunity besides early childhood, and I've been trying to underscore that I think the emerging adulthood window is an extremely important one. There are many case examples where that is the window when young people turn their lives around, if we provide them with some opportunities, some hope, and support. So this is a little list of what I think might be important for supporting resilience in emerging adulthood. And part of it is just to be aware of what's going on in this window of development. Part of it is to be culturally and contextually sensitive. We need to think about second chance opportunities. I've met many young people who've gone in a positive direction who had a pathway out of trouble. if we don't provide any doors to go through or any opportunities, it's very hard for young people to go down a positive road. And it's important to keep in mind that brain development is really on our side in this transition to emerging adulthood. And we can encourage that planfulness, thoughtfulness, and so forth. And keep in mind that many troubled people, not just Dr. Mattis, but many other troubled young people, have staged a recovery in the transition to adulthood. I'm going to close by talking just briefly about some new horizons, which we can discuss in more detail if you'd like. The fourth wave. What's happening in the fourth wave? You see a lot of expansion on the neurobiology of resilience. You see a growing interest in putting together an understanding of resilience from a biological level to the family level to the societal level, and also taking seriously of cultural processes in resilience that wasn't there before. I think one of the most intriguing examples for biological sensitivity to context is this notion of one of the most important neurobiological changes is insights about sensitivity to context. This idea that individuals may differ in how sensitive they are to the environment. I think that little Sarah was sensitive to the context, and that had a devastating effect when she experienced the loss of her caregivers. But it also facilitated her recovery afterwards. And I think that this notion of sensitivity and to context is going to have very important consequences for how we think about intervention. Also, there's much greater attention to linking together the family tradition, family resilience tradition with the individual resilience tradition. I was very surprised to realize recently that there's not much of a connection between those two areas of study. You would think they would be very connected, but I would invite you to look at the recent special issue of Family Relations, the journal. That's a whole journal issue devoted to family resilience. And there are articles in there about trying to understand what do we know about resilience at the level of a family system, and how is that connected to the resilience of the individual children in that system, and how do we support family resilience as a strategy for promoting resilience in children? That's being asked worldwide in the humanitarian world. In general, we're seeing a lot of globalization. Humanitarian agencies ranging from UNICEF to World Bank are beginning to conceptualize what they do in terms of promoting resilience, and they're interested in raising the bar for children worldwide beyond survival. And as soon as you do that, you begin to think about the needs of children in terms of resilience. I'm trying to stick to my time frame here, so I'm going to close out with a few take-home messages, and then we can take a few questions, hopefully. First of all, resilience is common. There are many ways to get there. There's not one pathway of resilience. There are many pathways to resilience, and there are many processes that contribute to resilience. Ordinary adaptive systems, like good functioning families, are very powerful. Those are the engines for resilience. Resilience can be supported and promoted deliberately. And the resilience of children and youth depends on the resilience of other systems, in particular the resilience of families and communities and societies. And I would also argue that the resilience of our global community depends on the resilience of young people everywhere. I called my book Ordinary Magic because I realized over the years of studying resilience that resilience doesn't, promoting resilience, the phenomenon of resilience, doesn't require anything rare or extraordinary, and it's a good thing. If we were trying to do something that was rare and extraordinary, it would create a much more of a challenge for all of us. But we can promote resilience. Resilience comes about through some very fundamental processes, and we know a lot about, and many of you in the audience know a lot about what we can do to build the capacity for resilience, to restore it, or to put it into place for children so that when they face adversity in the future, they will be prepared. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop there for just a moment and see if I can take some questions. Okay. So our master ceremony said I can take questions. We have microphones. So other people can hear you, please go to the mic.
How's that? Sound. Thank you, Dr. Masten. Really exciting research. I'm especially interested in the intersection of resilience and culture and policy. And I'm wondering if you're looking at, or who is looking at, the impact of poverty on the trajectory of children's lives.
Well, I think finally, I've been happy to see that in the current campaigns that are developing in politics, that everybody seems to be joining the conversation about inequality. Mm-hmm. And not just in the US. The inequality issue is raising up everywhere. But poverty has a profound effect. And absolutely. You see it, I see it firsthand all the time, working with families that are living in emergency shelters. And it's not only that poverty affects people now, there are cascading consequences over generations. We have research now indicating that, what happens to a child now can affect not only their own lifelong health, if they don't get enough nutrition, if they don't get good health care and so forth, but it also can be transmitted, mm-hmm. both through their biology and through the skills that they have and pass on in their own families. So right. Poverty is clearly a huge issue. And another thing that's, I think, been illuminating to me, I recently became involved in a forum, which is like a network working together at the National Academy of Sciences. It's the Forum on Investing in Young Children Globally. So I co-chair this forum, and I was invited to do that because I'm on the board of Children, Youth, and Families at the National Academies. It's not, investing in young children, I think World Bank or something. But actually, they're trying to bring together players from all over the world to try to figure out what should we be doing for children to promote healthy development lifelong around the world. What's the best way to invest both our money and our time? But it's being supported by Gates Foundation, World Bank, many other agencies. And what's been the most illuminating to me, traveling around the world and looking at programs, examples of highly successful programs in different countries of the world, is what's being done in very impoverished nations that are choosing to invest in their children in a way that the United States is not. To see that there are countries that don't have nearly the resources we have that are promoting healthier development in their children by making, resources available for families, by helping parents learn how to raise their children. They're doing it in many different ways, ranging from microloans to, making videos in pediatricians' offices so parents learn what they can be doing to promote healthy development. But I've been very intrigued to see what we could learn in this country from the successes of other countries that I think sometimes we don't think about as glowing examples of success, like Colombia, for example. They have really good programs for young children in Colombia, and they have really committed politicians who invest in young children. So I think worldwide that there's growing attention at the policy level. And when we go in this forum, when we visit a country, or region, we try to highlight successful programs, but we bring in the policymakers. We have policymakers on the forum, but we also bring them into these meetings, and they present and get engaged and hear about research and so forth. And it's been heartening. I mean, we live in a world where it's very disheartening to see what's going on in terms of conflict, refugees, and war, and very heartening to see that people are finally really taking seriously the issues presented by poverty. So I think there's a change. I don't know about Massachusetts. I'm hoping that you see it in policies in Massachusetts or other states that you're from. We certainly are seeing it bubble up seriously in Minnesota, where developmental scientists are being, testifying for the legislature, and they're actually changing their policies.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Masten. I actually have two questions regarding education, and I see that you see it as part of the system, and I have your book, so I'm sure you have more to say about it. But I think it's extremely important because they spend so much time in school.
Right.
And I know that our schools recently are under a lot of pressure in terms of academic rigor, but I don't feel that there's a lot of pressure around providing a nurturing environment across the board in schools. And then as kids graduate, and this is my second question, they turn 18, they graduate, they may or may not start college. At that point, all at once, the parents lose all their leverage with the kid who is on perhaps a slower schedule in terms of developing. But it's the same for all kids. So the parent loses all their leverage and influence on the system right at that point all at once. And I think education from beginning to end, there's a lot of things lacking there in terms of support for these kids.
Education in general, it's a very important theme, clearly. And in the resilience literature, the quality of education matters as early. You can think of education beginning even before a baby's born, but certainly after a baby's born, though, education in the form of early childhood education and involvement, whether it's what we do with parents in ECFE or daycare or whatever, there's a lot more recognition that the quality of the educational environment, which may be a daycare kind of environment early on, but then becomes preschool and then becomes school. On this issue of nurturing and structure, most of the research on resilience indicates that what I would call a striking parallel between the most effective schools and the most effective families. They both have this kind of authoritative flavor to them, this combination of high expectations, high structure, and warmth and nurturing. It's a combination. And when I recently visited an extremely interesting school setting in Minneapolis where they're getting some of the best test scores in the state for young African American boys, and just to see what they were doing. And the school had that flavor. Some people, I think, would come into the school and think, whoa, this is very academic, it's very strict, the kids wear uniforms. But if you go there in person, you feel the commitment, the warmth, and these children are embraced like family members. The Northside Achievement Zone is another example from Minneapolis that was modeled. It's a Promise neighborhood modeled on the Harlem Achievement Zone. The idea there is really a systems idea that if you're going to promote academic achievement in young disadvantaged children, which is crucial in our society, then you've got to engage the whole community, all the business leaders, everybody in doing that. Disadvantaged families can't do this on their own. The schools that they attend can't do this on their own. It's overwhelming. There are classrooms in our poorest neighborhoods in Minneapolis where half of the children are homeless and highly mobile. That is an unbelievable challenge for a teacher to try to, help children learn who have that kind of instability at home. A lot of the kids come to school they're hungry, they're tired, and they're stressed. It's not optimal. And of course, pretty soon the teacher gets stressed because you have all these stressed out children in the classroom. The schools and classrooms and teachers that are very, very effective are themselves supportive, warm, with high expectations and a strong focus, I think, on what they're trying to do. But they're also supported by other systems. It's the same idea. A school that shows resilience, a school that functions well in a highly difficult situation, maybe with a lot of kids from a poverty background, they also, what are the protective factors for those schools? They usually have good leadership too, but those schools are supported by other members of the community, by businesses, by other systems. We could talk like a whole nother conference about what to do in academic achievement and how do we foster and support learning, lifelong learning. I don't know quite how to respond to this issue of the transition to, out of the so-called control of the family. I just know that a lot of the people I know, does that say time to stop? Okay. A lot of the people I know provide a tremendous amount of support to their young people as they make the transition into adulthood. In fact, I like to define adulthood as having and paying for your own car insurance and health insurance. By that definition, hardly any of the kids I know of professors are adults yet. It's around age 30 when they make it. But it's a very serious issue. I mean, we know for some reason in the world right now you need a lot more support. And I think we're finally learning that in the foster care system. You need to provide a lot more support for the transition to adulthood for young people coming out of foster care systems than we used to think was necessary. The world has changed. But I'm going to have to stop. I'll be around all day if you want to ask me more questions or have conversations.